Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your global look at news from Taiwan. I'm Reece Ayers. Situated just about 10 kilometers off the Chinese city of Xiamen, the tiny Taiwanese island of Kinmen has played an important role in the cross-strait relations between Taiwan and China over the last century. Its proximity to China made it an important military post for Taiwan. Its closeness to China also means that people that live there often have deeper connections to China than other Taiwanese. So to discuss the island of Kinmen, its historical importance, and the subject of Taiwanese identity, we're joined today by filmmaker Leo Chiang. Now, Leo has recently been in Kinmen making a documentary film about the island, and it's called Island in Between, and it can be found on the New York Times website. Thank you for joining us, Leo.
Thanks, Reece. I'm very happy to be here.
So, Leo, why Kinmen? You spent a lot of time there over the last year or two. Why Kinmen? Why is it so important? And why is it so important to you in particular?
As a Taiwanese person, I think all of us who grew up in Taiwan were fascinated by Kinmen, but most of us actually know very little about it. I, for instance, only heard about Kinmen through my father, who served there for his mandatory military service in the 1960s. And I've always been fascinated by it. I've always wanted to tell Taiwanese stories, but it's actually really difficult to visually represent the situation of Taiwan, especially in its relationship to China and the cross-strait conflict. The images I've seen of Kinmen has always have the military artifacts, but also really beautiful traditional Southern Taiwanese architecture. Those in combination, in some strange ways, represents Taiwan better than any images on the Taiwan main island.
So what was it like filming in Kinmen? What kinds of people did you meet and what stories did you learn?
So I got to know Kinmen through my father's stories when he was serving there in the military. So I think that I went with this perhaps a misconception that everything there is about the military. Which turned out not to be my experience at all. They are older folks who actually lived through the conflict, but also younger generations who have never seen any of that, who might have spent some time in Taiwan, had decided to return to Kinmen. And actually, some of the most interesting conversations that I had were with Lu Pei, so mainland women who had married either people in Kinmen or they had married Taiwanese who were living in China and decided to move back to Kinmen.
So, Leo, what role has Kinmen played historically and culturally in the story of Taiwan and China?
Kinmen has always been the front line. At least it's I think in the film I talked about Kinmen and sort of the body of water between Kinmen and Xiamen being the boundary, being the border between good and evil. I mean, as we grew up, as we grew older, we realized that a lot of that is propaganda, right? There was a conflict and there was a lot of war, a lot of heartbreak, a lot of, death and destruction. And Kinmen was actually the only place in Taiwan that had seen that firsthand, So its role kind of changed from this border. I mean, it's still on the border, but it changed from this place where it's about like antagonism to a place that's about communication and it's about relating to the people in China. So that flip is super interesting to me.
And has that reversed somewhat in recent years, given the increasing tensions?
Well, I don't think that the local Kinmenese feel the reversal so much, right? I think that perhaps the rest of Taiwan, certainly the West, the folks who kind of consider what the Chinese government is doing to be a threat, perhaps see that the Kinmen's role has reversed again. But if you speak to the local Kinmenese, they still very much feel like we want to keep closer relationships to China because these are our relatives.
When I saw the title of your film, Island in Between, I knew immediately what it would be about. If anyone's familiar with Taiwan and its geography, they know that Kinmen maybe has this reputation. And it is literally and metaphorically the island in between. Could you explain a bit more about that metaphorical side of things?
I've always been fascinated by borders, and I always been fascinated by the in-betweenness. And perhaps it's because me myself have traveled past borders often, and me myself always feel like I'm somebody who does exist and live in between, which used to be something that I struggle a lot. Trying to find a place to belong, trying to find a home. But lately, I've been embracing this identity of somebody who does exist in between, and have found many compatriots who exist in this same in-between land, exist on the border as I do.
How do people from the main island of Taiwan view Kinmen? And has that perception changed over the years as Kinmen today plays a less prominent role than it did perhaps a few decades before?
I have, in my conversations with folks in the process of making this film, really also learn a lot about the complicated relationship between the Taiwanese main island folks versus the Kinmen folks. Because of the very different history, they actually see sort of a cultural gap between the Kinmeners and the main Taiwanese islanders. And I think that there's also this idea that Kinmen is much closer to China. Maybe the most, I would say, divisive or terrible things that I've heard of is like some young Taiwanese people say, "Hey, you Kinmeners should just go back to China because you don't belong with us." And for the Kinmeners, is a very, very difficult thing to hear, because they already are sort of geographically marginalized. They also are, some ways, culturally marginalized by that.
We're about to zoom out from the context of Kinmen now, but before we do, let's take a look at a clip from Leo's film, Island in Between.
I sang the song all the time as a kid. We were taught that we Taiwanese were Chinese in exile. And one day, with help from the US, we would retake China, freeing the mainland from the evil communists.
So in that clip there, we just saw some archive footage of a very, very famous song from Taiwan. Can you tell us a bit more about what that song is?
Every single Taiwanese person, probably, 40 and above, something like that. It was just, everyone knew how to sing that song.
It's shocking. The lyrics were shocking.
And it didn't, I think as kids we're just, it was no different than just like a lullaby or anything else, right? That you sing along on the playground. It's really like sort of normalized.
The lyrics are quite aggressive, surprisingly aggressive. Yeah. Was it not until you were kind of a bit older that you realized, what the song was actually referring to?
I don't think it necessarily taught me to be more aggressive, but I also grew up in a time where we had maybe monthly or every other month, we have air raid siren drills. We had to like duck under the table, or sometimes we have to go into the bunkers as practice. My grandmother's house in Kaohsiung, for instance, in the old Kaohsiung County, now Kaohsiung City, our basement was the bomb shelter for the whole block. So it's very, very normal, everyday existence, especially as children growing up in that environment. You don't feel it's anything, like you don't feel scared, you don't feel it's unusual. It's just how I grew up.
In the documentary, you mentioned wanting to figure out your own relationship with China and Taiwan. So what did you learn about that from making this film?
When I first made this film, I wasn't thinking that I would be a part of it. I really were, I really were very, very curious about what the Kinmenese stories, that I wanted to hear their stories from their perspective. But the more time I spent there, I realized that their situation, being, to me, sort of being sandwiched in between Taiwan and China, in some ways mirrors both my own situation of being somebody who who was born in Taiwan but grew up in the US and feel very much in the middle and not wholly one thing or another, which I think a lot of Jimenese would say that that's their experience too. But then also, to me, that's Taiwan, Taiwan being right now sandwiched between China and the US and having very complicated relationship with both sides, but also having ambivalence and concerns about our relationship with both sides. All three of those things connect, and so I feel like putting my story in it, putting my own experience, actually helped to tell this very complicated situation.
Can you tell us a bit more about that? Why is the topic of Taiwanese identity so complex?
I certainly don't represent the majority of Taiwanese who were born and raised here and they spent their whole life here, and their identity is very different from mine. That said, I feel like I have this perspective of how, I perhaps know more about how other people see us as Taiwanese. And I'm sure that those interactions have influenced the way that I see myself as a Taiwanese person. And growing up, I very much, thought that I am Chinese, even though my family has been in Taiwan for many generations. But in the last 10, 20 years, that very much has shifted. I know that some folks are perhaps the people who are very much supporting Taiwanese self-determination will never say that they're Chinese at all. But I don't necessarily think that I need to deny my Chinese ethnic heritage in order to support Taiwanese people to decide their own future.
During your time living in the States, have you found that you've kind of had to be a teacher to people abroad who don't know much about Taiwan, even today?
Constantly. I mean, the joke that everybody who've spent some time outside of Taiwan are very familiar with is that people confuse Taiwan with Thailand. It's absurd. I actually, in some ways, I think a lot of Taiwanese abroad have to take some responsibility, because for a lot of times we were taught to always outwardly tell people that we're Chinese. So people are very confused. I think, again, in the last 10 years, the folks who are in the US that I meet, the Taiwanese, either Taiwanese American or Taiwanese who are living in the US, they are more likely to say that they're Taiwanese.
Finally, what do you see as the future of your relationship with your Taiwanese Chinese American identity? Or maybe on a wider scale, what might the future look like for the Taiwanese identity in general?
Wow, that's a very difficult question. I can only speak for myself, which that I do know by now that it will always evolve. Which is, in some ways, that's interesting, because folks are usually kind of finding a place to stake a claim and say, this is me, and I finally found myself. But I actually, in my experience, I feel like identity is fluid. And if you're always learning and if you're always experiencing new things, if you're not closed off to the world, then your identity will continue to evolve.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Leo. I think we've all learned a bit more about Kinmen today.
Thank you, Reece. It's been fun.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. For more stories from TaiwanPlus, you can find us on social media, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, anywhere you get your social media posts. I've been Reece Ayers, and thank you, viewers, for joining us.